I believe the way that we listen to music today is taken for granted. Only a few hundred years ago, it was likely that you would only ever hear your favorite composition once or twice within your lifespan. But now you can listen to your favorite overture over and over again endlessly with just your phone. What's just as interesting as the music itself is the formats that we use to play back these sounds. Nowadays, it's 99% streaming, but since the late 1800s, there have been dozens of attempts, both successful and unsuccessful, to make the enjoyment of listening to music more convenient and easy to obtain. This iceberg is specifically on music formats that either failed or had limited success but didn't have longevity. It's been like 5 years at this point since the iceberg format became popular, so I don't think I need to explain it to you. You know, the top is the unobscure parts and the bottom is the obscure parts. This is just part 1 and there are a few more formats to talk about, but with that out of the way, let's begin.
It's a MD. It's a Sony.
Now, MiniDisc is a unique case because it technically didn't fail to sell, and they still actually do produce them. The format would release in 1992 and would mainly be used in radio stations to record PSAs, commercials, and bumpers. But they would attempt to get into the commercial market by releasing these MiniDisc Walkmen that you could either play back your own recorded discs onto or buy pre-recorded albums. Sony assumed that the format would become cheaper over time, but the market for them was just not there. Because portable music formats are mainly aimed towards teenagers and young adults, the high prices that these mini discs and players would go for would discourage any teenager who's either going off of minimum wage or allowance from actually buying the format. And a few years later, CDRs would come out and would be sold for less than $1. They were going for hundreds of dollars, and music companies were not really up to jump on the format, so that meant limited releases and a price too high for the market that they were trying to go after. Then later on, CDRs got even more cheaper, which are essentially the same thing as a mini disc, but I would say from personal experience, less efficient. But if I was a kid in the 90s, the efficiency wouldn't be worth the cost. I mean, it's an extra 30 seconds of dealing with a slightly bigger format because they're functionally the same thing, but the mini disc is just in a nicer, more compact package. Speaking of using them and their features, I actually have a mini disc player and a few mini discs from my old high school. They work a lot like cassettes. You put in a blank mini disc and then you plug in whatever source you want to record onto it, may it be a microphone or a tape player or a record player. And I'm also pretty sure that some of them have a feature where if you record, let's say, an album onto it, it can detect when a song ends and then it will start a new track, so you don't have just one long 30-minute file you'll need to skip through. They could record from 60 to 74 to 80 minutes of audio, and then later on, high MDs, which were nicer mini discs, could hold up a gigabyte of data. While the effort to make it into a mainstream format for pre-recorded albums would die out by the late 90s, the format would continue to, and even to an extent today, be used in more official, professional settings. Another problem they had is that they can't be rewritten. Just like a CDR, if you record something or you transfer something onto the disc, well, you can't wipe it, it's there forever. And for the market, which was used to cassettes, where you can record and re-record over and over again on the same tape, that and the price made it undesirable and inefficient. Also, the reason why this is on the top is because Kanye used one as his album cover for Yeezus. Speaking of Kanye, I wonder where he is right now. The tefifon is easily one of the most interesting formats I'm going to be talking about here. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. Truly, it is a unique case for commercial music. There was one dictaphone that used a similar technology, but who cares about that? No, that's not what this video is about, okay? Now, at a first glance, you may think it's a tape player, but it's actually a plastic ribbon with grooves like a record placed inside of it, like a record engraved on top. There's a pretty wide range of how long these tapes could run for. It could be 50 minutes, an hour, or even 4 hours. The cartridges themselves are laid out to be endlessly looping. This same method was used later for 4 tracks and 8 tracks, along with some other obscure formats, where the ribbon itself is laid out in a way that it will endlessly loop over and over again. The technology was originally released for audio recording in the 1930s, mainly used by the government. And it wouldn't be until the 1940s when the first tefifon players would hit the market for people to buy. They had players that were like boom boxes that you could take along with you, and they also had radios which had a tefifon player and sometimes even a record player inside of them. It's interesting to see what's essentially the first boombox. There were portable record players in the past, but these designs that you see in the 1940s are very similar to 1960s and 70s cassette and 8-track players. Despite how novel they weren't very popular with consumers for a few reasons. For one, a lot of popular artists were signed exclusively to specific record labels, which means that you couldn't find their music on cartridges. So they would use unknown studio bands that would mainly record covers of other songs. Also at this time, record players with record changers were hitting the market, which meant that you could have multiple hours of music playing at a time. The format would make it to the early 60s, and the last innovation would be adding stereo sound. But again, it would not be successful and would completely die soon after. If I was a German in the 1940s, not that kind of German, I would own one of these. Alright, yes, automatic record players are great, but the efficiency and the amount of music these things had on them, depending on which one you bought, and the fact that I don't really care about named artists back then, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. There were definitely a number of artists that stand out to me, but I've listened to a lot of music recorded before the 1950s, and most of it sounds more or less the same. And it's something I would mainly use for easy listening specifically. The artists being known bands just doesn't matter to me. Also, most of you probably know about this format because Techmoan made a video about them, along with a number of the other formats on this list. And he uses a song from one of the cartridges in his puppet segments. The Edison Diamond Disc is an interesting case because it is an exceptionally stupid idea, especially coming from a famous inventor like Edison. In the late 1800s, Edison cylinders would hit the market, and they would be the only thing you could play back pre-recorded music onto, besides music box discs and those automated band machines, whatever they're called, that you can find. They were the only format that you could listen to pre-recorded music onto. But as the 1800s came to a close, the phonograph disc hit the market, and they had a few more benefits that the Edison cylinder did not. For one, a song would be placed on either side of the record, which was not always the case. They used to only be one-sided, but eventually they started putting songs on both sides, while the Edison cylinder could only hold one. Another issue the Edison cylinder had was storage. They're can-shaped, so they're pretty awkward to store, while records can be stacked next to each other like books or folders, and they're very thin, so they're pretty space efficient to store. Once the Edison cylinder started to die out, there were a few attempts at bringing it back, like the Edison gold molded cylinder and the Amberol cylinder, and it was time to move on. And Edison's genius decision was to release his own disc format. And at first, it might sound great. For one, it uses a diamond-tipped stylus. At the time, phonographs used steel needles. Because of the heavy tracking force that came along with playing records on phonographs, using a material that would not wear down to play records would ruin the records after a few plays. So they decided to use steel, which the record would wear down instead. Needing to constantly swap out phonograph needles from experience is pretty tedious. So Edison came up with the diamond tip stylus. It's just like a modern stylus that doesn't get worn down unless you play a lot of records on it. But the first weird decision here was the way that the grooves are set out. Phonograph records have the grooves laid out laterally, meaning they wave back and forth, while the diamond disc, just like the Edison cylinder, had the grooves go in vertically, meaning the needle goes up and down into the grooves instead of side to side. So this meant that if you bought a diamond disc but tried to play it on a normal phonograph, or you tried to play a normal phonograph disc on an Edison diamond disc player, the records would be destroyed because the players are not compatible with each other. Another strange thing is how thick the records are. I assume this is because they were cut in vertically, but this is like 3 records stacked on top of each other. So even though they're more efficient to store than Edison cylinders, they still can take up a lot of space. They were also expensive and had a limited amount of genres you could buy. So for somebody who was buying a record player in the 1920s, really what would you want? A record player that you can play virtually every single record label onto, or a phonograph you could only play one specific kind of record on, with a limited amount of releases. It's kind of like an Ouya versus a PS4 for the silent generation.
Well, sure, everything around the place is upside down, and I can't find the darn thing. Shut up!
My name is and I hate
RCA Victor tape recorders are so easy to operate. You can actually do it blindfolded.
The RCA tape cartridge seems more like an experiment than an actual consumer product. Released in 1958, reel-to-reel tape recorders had already been in the market for about 10 years at that point. Another thing innovated on by the Germans during a certain time in history. And these cartridges were marketed as a more efficient version of this same format. With reel-to-reels, you need to take the tapes off one by one, and you'll need a take-up reel, but with the RCA tape cartridge, everything, just like a cassette, is built into the cartridge itself, and you can record, rewind, playback, everything much more easily than with a reel-to-reel. Despite the fact that they were more efficient, the price and the lack of pre-recorded albums, and RCA not really producing many machines, meant the tape format would die out, but later on the concept would be used in 1962 to create the compact cassette, and they come off as more of a stepping stone for what would later become the golden standard than anything else. The playtape is not necessarily a failed format, but it's one that is definitely forgotten now and had a very short lifespan. They look and function like miniature 8-track tapes and would hold around 8 to 24 minutes of audio. They would release in 1966 and would have a few successful years with around 3,000 artists publishing their music on this format. They also released players for cars, just like 8-tracks and cassettes. Also, like I mentioned earlier, back then people would record messages on tapes to be sent over the mail. And in 1968, they would start selling tapes that you could record messages onto for that purpose. They were mainly used in Japan and would survive until 1971, but soon died out to cassettes and 8-tracks as they could hold more music. Released in 1999, the point of DVD audio was to utilize the higher quality possibilities of putting music on DVDs, which have more storage than on CDs. I actually have a few of these, and they have animated menu screens, but no actual video. It was specifically for music with a little bit of pizzazz with the menus. They were expensive, so the main market would have been audiophiles, but they quickly would fizzle out by the early 2000s. Blue Spec is the newest format on this list, released in 2008, which means some of you may actually be younger than this format, and it used similar technology to Blu-ray discs, but they could be played back on normal CD players, unlike a Blu-ray disc that cannot be played on a DVD player. They were released by Sony. What's strange about this format is that even though there was a lot of talk about it, it seems like not really many albums were ever released, and it was more like an idea that came out, and it was technically better than CDs, but at that time streaming was already popular, CDs were dying out, and even though it was impressive, nobody really cared. Strangely, an album was released on it in 2018 though by Wasabi Records, who would put out Foundations Digging the Foundations, along with 40 Trips Around the Sun by Toto. Voiceograph discs aren't a failed format, but they are relatively obscure, and eventually they got phased out as tapes became more common for people to own at home. It's kind of crazy to think about now, but in the past, it was cheaper to send an audio message over the mail than it was to call somebody long distance. So starting in the 50s, people would buy audio tape recorders, record messages to family and friends, and then send it over the mail. And to capitalize on this market, voiceograph booths started springing up in a few cities in the United States. They look like phone booths, but when you go in, and you'll be able to spend 25 cents to record a short 1-minute personalized audio disc that can be sent over the mail. These discs have a cardboard base and have some sort of plastic lacquer finish put on top of it that a record cutter inside of the booth would record onto. You can see on the label it has a space for the date, from, and to. A problem with these discs is because of the material they're made out of, they don't last very long and they wear out very easily. But that's by design. You weren't really meant to listen to these things more than once or twice, so it didn't really matter.
You know what day today is? Why, today is March. You know what that day means? That day means it's a birthday. And you know whose birthday this is? That's right. Joey's birthday, and Barbara is going to be there, and Mommy and Daddy, and everybody else. So we'll sing happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you, Happy birthday, dear Joey. Happy birthday to you. Hi, Joey Baba.
Going back to the early years of the phonograph, while phonograph discs first came out in 1895, there was a period of about 2 decades where there was a number of experimentation around the speed and the size of the discs and how the grooves were laid out before they finally reached the standardized shellac records that you will usually see. One of the things they experimented with was where the needle should start on the record. Now virtually every record starts at the edge, but Pathé released discs that started by the center. This is because the distance that the needle has to travel improves, and if you've ever played a phonograph record, you've probably noticed that at the start there's a lot of white noise and hissing, but once you start getting towards the end of the disc, that noise will dissipate and it will become more clean. Another thing was the speed. I didn't mention this earlier, but the diamond disc spun at 80 RPM opposed to 78 RPM. Pathé would release these 20-inch discs that would spin at 120 RPM opposed to 78 for quality. But the size, the weight, the inconvenience, and the fact that these early records were recorded through horns, which already decreased the quality of the recordings themselves, regardless of how high quality the recorder you're using is, meant that the market didn't care. Just like the Edison Diamond Disc, Pathé would release a reusable phonograph needle made from sapphire. Although what's unique about them is that they're not needle-shaped, they're round. Despite all these innovations, all of these efforts to either make the format sound better or being more efficient for playback so you didn't have to constantly replace needles, all these attempts would eventually lead to nothing as the market adapted the generalized 78 RPM record made from shellac that would start playback at the edge. There are a number of other experimental discs, but the vast majorities were not commercially available and they didn't have music pre-recorded onto them, so that's a topic for another video. Duophone was a company that started releasing records in the late 1920s, and their discs came along with their own unique player that had 2 reproducers instead of 1. Now the advertised benefit of this was a louder, more crisp sound, which is what I've heard from people who have actually owned them, but the issue wasn't the player itself, it was the discs that the company would release. They would release records on shellac, but they also had their own records that were released on an unbreakable format, and while you could drop them and bend them without breaking them, unlike a shellac record, whatever they used, I assume it had maybe a cardboard base and they put a lacquer finish on top, just like an acetate demo or those voiceograph discs I was talking about earlier. The grooves were very brittle and you could not play records more than a few times before they were destroyed. And it's very ironic that you can see on some of these records they have a parody of the MGM lion biting into one of these records. A pretty smug thing for them to do. While what actually happened is a majority of their catalog is probably now lost, not because the customers weren't careful with their records, but because they were so poorly designed that they would self-destruct through general use. While MGM is not only still a company, but the majority of their catalog, I'm sure, even from back then, is still available. I guess it's karma for trying to be prideful. The first Duophone record would be released in 1925, and the company would make it until 1930. A very short lifespan, but ironically longer than most of their records likely lasted. Anyways, that is the end of part 1. Tell me what you think. The reason why the audio here sounds kind of weird is because I'm recording it on a Dictaphone 10, a mini cassette voice recorder from around 1970. Anyways, that's it for me. Don't forget to subscribe to the Mr. Epic on YouTube.com, and I love crap.
You know what? Just fuck you.